morning, everybody. Well, good morning. Good to see you all this morning. As we continue on with this series that we're going to be doing, at least tentatively, I've been referring to as church rules or church rules, depending on how you want to emphasize it. But the idea of how to try to be holy people in a complex and real world. Jesus said, "Go out into the world, and now it's your turn. Go be the church." And now here we are, Chicago, United States, 2025. How would we try to put that into practice in very practical means? And so we're going to be spending some time in this series up through Lent. We're going to be spending some time looking at things about how we try to be the church in the world, specifically through the lens of how do we design the rules and guidelines about being the church in this world. This will tell us a lot about, in theory, if we're doing this well, this should be telling us theologically who we think we are and the church is, and what a Christian is in the world, what a person of faith is in the world. So, starting us off, is it fair for me to assume that we're all passingly familiar with the United States Constitution? Right, so we had this whole idea of independence, we became our own nation, and then it became similar to Jesus, saying, now go be the church. We got independence, and now we had to think to ourselves, now how are we going to be a country? Are we going to have a king? Right? Are we going to give voting rights to only noble landholders that can pass down by heredity? Are we going to have slaves or not? Right? How will we decide who has to be a slave or not? Right? We had to set all of these rules up in our Constitution in the United States, and we set up structures, and we set up a democracy, and we designed the three branches of government: an executive, judicial, and legislative, and we had them at federal, state, and local levels, and we came up with a system of how those people will be chosen. And that system has evolved over time. Right? There was a time where, in order to be one of those office holders, you had to be a man. We got rid of that rule. There was a time in which, in order to vote, you had to be white. Right? We got rid of that rule. Right? As we've evolved and we've changed. There is a constitution for the Episcopal Church that's not altogether different than that. And if you know your church history, it shouldn't be surprising because we come from the Church of England. And since our ancestry comes from the Church of England, we found ourselves at the very same time that the United States was having to think to itself, now what kind of country are we going to be now that we're independent? Once the Church of England in the colonies became independent, because we didn't want to be the Church of England anymore, couldn't be the Church of England anymore, we decided we were going to be the Episcopal Church, and the question became, how are we going to be the Episcopal Church in the world? And we did the exact same thing that was happening in civic life, was the same thing that was happening in our church life. We drafted a constitution. In fact, a lot of the same people who worked on the Constitution were the same people who worked on the Constitution for the Episcopal Church. You'll notice it has a lot of similar mechanisms. But I thought this would be a good place to start, because really at the heart of this gets to who the Episcopal Church sees it as a church. Before we dig into some of the, we're going to look at things like some of the articles and look at some of the structure and think together about what does this mean about the kind of church we are in the world. But I'm going to make my plug for this real quick, which is people frequently come to me and ask me, what's the Episcopal Church? Why, what makes it different than other churches? And specifically, actually, they will come to me because the worship is very similar to Roman Catholicism, right? If you come, we have a lot of people who come into our church on a Sunday morning and they'll say, oh, I thought I was in a Catholic church. Usually until Lisa gets up and starts presiding over the worship service, right? Or they see my wedding ring or something like that. Yeah. Then they realize, oh, I'm not in a Catholic church. But then they start asking, well, what is it exactly that makes it different than the Catholic Church? What makes the Episcopal Church different? And over the years, I've heard many reasons, I've given many reasons, I've talked about how, well, our worship is similar, but you'll notice We don't have private. We don't mandate private confessional before receiving communion. We have a corporate confessional we all do together. You'll notice that little things like we offer gluten-free bread for people who have celiac disease, right? That's something they don't have in the Roman Catholic Church. Little stuff like that. We let clergy marry. We do same-sex marriages. We affirm women being in clergy, positions of clergy. Even our bishops. Our Bishop of Chicago is a woman. All of those are sort of like very superficial outward signs of how we're different, but I think they all point to a deeper difference that's more how I've come to describe how is the Episcopal Church different. And I think it's this. It's our Constitution. People want to say like, oh well, who is your Pope? Not Sean Bottle, sorry, Sean Bottle is our parishioner of ours. I was going to say, so if we had Sean Rowe as our current presiding bishop, people will look and they'll say, oh, Sean's like your Pope. He is not really like our Pope. He doesn't have the authority vested in him that the Pope has. He wasn't selected in the way the Pope was selected. It's very different. They'll say, oh, well, maybe is Paula Clark like your Pope? And you have like a local Pope. No, Paula Clark's not like our Pope either. I've actually started making the argument to say if we have anything that's like a Pope, it's actually probably our Constitution is like our Pope. Where what we've done, and this points to the fundamental difference of the Episcopal Church, is rather than vesting the power in a person and saying this person has the authority to decide our church, we democratically have vested the authority in a set of guidelines and rules that we democratically have created and evolved, and that is our guideline. So if you're going to say like, oh well, who is your equivalent of the Pope? It's not Michael Curry or Sean Rowe. I would argue it's our Constitution is like our Pope. Does that make sense? And I think that points to why some of the fundamental differences. Why do we ordain women in the church? We ordain women in the church because we have democratically decided that men and women are both equally valid to serve as ordained leaders in our church. Not because we didn't have a pope somewhere that said, thou shalt ordain women now. We set it up in our democratic structures. When we decided we were going to start doing, doing same-sex weddings across our nation, across the Episcopal Church, it's not because we had a pope come in and say, you all now have to do this whether you like it or not. It wouldn't come from a person. It came from us democratically coming together and saying, do we want this? Do we want to affirm this? And we put it to a vote, and we together, the people of the Episcopal Church, affirmed it and said, yes, this is what we want to do. We want marriage equality for all people, regardless of sexual orientation. So that's kind of our guidelines instead of a pope. So before we start looking into some of this a little deeper, any thoughts, questions about that? Kind of neat, isn't it? I like it. I was a political science nerd before I became an Episcopalian, so in retrospect, it makes perfect sense I became an Episcopalian, because I was like, it's like political science in a religion.
It is a
right. And we still share our roots coming from the Church of England. We're still part of the greater Anglican communion. Right? And so some of our structure will talk about how do we maintain this sort of broad Anglican identity even while we try to figure out how we want to do it locally, with sort of like our local United States flavor of it. Right?
There's very big differences between the Episcopal Church and the Church of England, almost as much as the Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church. I mean, the whole reason the Episcopal Church was formed was because the United States, Stephen mentioned, the United States, the revolution was happening at the same time, and the key to the U.S. Constitution is you shall not establish a state religion.
Sure.
The king shouldn't be in charge of things.
As opposed to there being a state religion.
That's still the case in the Anglican Church. Is the King of England, the Queen of England, is the head of the church, of the Anglican Church. So I mean, there are big differences between
even while
the Church of England and the Episcopal Church too.
yeah, no, they make a very good point. Liturgically, you'll notice if you go to a Church of England worship service over in England, the worship will feel very similar, and outwardly it will look very similar. But you're right, the inner structure can be different in some significant ways. When our most recent dean, prior to the very Reverend Lisa Hackney James, Dominic Barrington, was here, and he was selected to be the Dean of York. He had to have the permission of the monarch, who at the time was Queen Elizabeth II. Queen Elizabeth II had to sign the document commissioning him to be the Dean of York, which led to no small amount of crisis when right after doing that, then she died. And there was some concern. What if Charles III becomes king and decides to rescind it? Now, he didn't. But now there's a new head of the church. What if he did? I'd have to look and see, did he have the authority to? But it was something they talked about. And so it would be the equivalent of if we in the United States said that the President of the United States had to have the right of refusal to decide who could and couldn't be bishop. That you may elect Paula Clark to be the Bishop of Chicago, but then Joe Biden today or Donald Trump tomorrow would have to sign off on it and approve Paula Clark being our bishop. That sounds really weird to us here in the United States, but that is the structure in Church of England. Yeah.
It was interesting to go to watch Jimmy Carter's funeral at the Washington National Cathedral with Sean Rowe there and all the presidents. And, I don't know. I wonder if you have to prove it.
Well, right, because you're right. In the U.S. Constitution, we do have this idea of what's implied, and not specifically said, but separation of church and state, right? But we see all sorts of instances in which church and state, of course, are constantly touching one another, and leading also to the ongoing debate of what was the purpose of separating church and state? Was it to protect the state from the church, or was it to protect the church from the state, right? So thinking about it from the perspective of, in, say, Church of England, where the churches very much play a civic role, this is even where we still get the word parishes. Most states call them counties now, but even if you go to, say, like Louisiana, where they call their counties parishes, right? And in the center of each of those parishes would have been a church. That would have been, and the people of that parish would have been the people who civically, even today in the Church of England, there are rules that all people who are within that parish are members of that church. Now, they may never set foot in the building, and they may be atheists, or they may be Buddhists or Hindus or something, and they don't go to that church. But from a civic standpoint, they fall under the jurisdiction of that parish. To your point, Andrew, talking about where we see a little bit of sort of bleed through and overlap in these areas, it's worth noting every president of the United States we've ever elected, ostensibly, has been Christian. It's not something that's a requirement specifically. We don't say in the U.S. Constitution, it does not say that the president has to be a Christian. But notice, we haven't elected a non-Christian, or at least outwardly professing non-Christian. It was a long time, it wasn't that long ago in our history where it was a big deal in the 1960 election about whether or not we would elect a Catholic president. That was a big deal. So it wasn't even just Christian, it was sort of like the right kind of Christian. But if you go back and you look at old presidential debates, there were a lot of people that their chief concern was, if we elect John F. Kennedy president, he's going to be taking orders from the Pope. And it'll basically, a vote for John F. Kennedy is a vote for the Pope ruling our nation. And so that's not separation of church and state. And now that didn't end up being what came to pass, of course. But it was something we were talking about. Yeah, John, you had
Just as an historical note, it took some time for the Supreme Court to decide that the First Amendment and other amendments applied to state entities? Do they just apply to rigid to the federal court? So there were some states early on that had official state churches. It wasn't like England and where it was that intertwined, but there were, you pay taxes and it would go to the church.
Right.
From the state.
Yeah. Yeah. So and yeah, you're absolutely right. And a lot of the colonies, right from their very founding as colonies, were founded by specific religious denominations, religious perspectives. Some even so I grew up in Massachusetts, and of course we taught Massachusetts state history, and we were always taught in Massachusetts state history, in the 80s at least, they were teaching that Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by people who were fleeing religious persecution, and they wanted freedom to practice their own religion. Because remember, they were coming from a place where there was a state religion that was not theirs. Right? These are the Puritans. Yep. Right? I don't know if they taught that in Illinois the same way they taught it in Massachusetts, but we were taught Massachusetts Bay Colony was formed by Puritans who were fleeing state-controlled religion. Who promptly set up a colony where they instituted their religion and asserted it, and it was a state-controlled religion, but it was their religion. Right? Their purpose was not freedom of all religion; it was freedom to practice our religion. And that was when all of these colonies were deciding what kind of state do we want to have, and it was a blended mix of different colonies, some that were formed by different religious groups, some that were formed by different secular groups, and deciding if we're going to be one nation, one of the things we're going to have to decide is, do we want to have a mandated state religion? And so we said, no, we don't want to have that. But you make a good point, Andrew, in that throughout our whole history, though, there's long-standing been this back and forth about religious engagement in political life. You are going to see at the inauguration tomorrow, I'm assuming the President of the United States will be taking the oath of office on a Bible. I'm assuming, unless he chooses not to, but that's been the tradition, as making these vows on a Christian Bible. What does that say about separation of church and state? There will be prayers. Notice that we start our legislative process. Every Congress, every congressional session opens up with prayers in the beginning. There's a Christian chaplain in Congress. So it's not a state-mandated religion, but let's not think that it's not involved because it is involved. Yeah, Molly.
I have a question on how religious views influence our views on church and state. So I believe in the separation of church and state, but I was recently challenged by my wonderful Catholic father about examples like murder and stealing are illegal in the United States because they are immoral. Well, who decides what is and is not immoral?
Yes.
God. So how is that not separated? And I didn't really have an answer for that. So what are your thoughts on how God and Scripture influences these decisions in our legal making process?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, we're getting back on, maybe before we even get to the Constitution yet, we have to get to a more fundamental level about this question, which is, anybody here remember, was it a year ago? And if I say a year ago, it was probably 2 years ago, that we did a whole thing on Christian ethics. Remember that one, where we were talking about ethical decision making? And one of the things we talked about was how we are all part of different ethical structures, ethical frameworks, and they affect each other. And so one of your ethical frameworks might be, I'm a member of a family. I'm a member of the Balke family, right? And we as Balkes have decided that murdering people is not how we solve our problems. Right? That's a good ethical framework for our family. We may be a part of a religion. Now, was that influenced by our religion, where we are also a part of a religion that says that murder is wrong? Now, that may be where the family rule came from, or we may have decided that independently. But either way, at least we're in agreement. In my family and in my religion, we agree murder is the wrong thing to do. we ostensibly are part of a nation in the United States, which has created rules and or laws, and our laws are often an attempt to try to enforce an ethical framework on people who we all are doing our own moral decision making. We can probably all agree in this room, I'm sure we can all agree in this room, murder is wrong. Probably, general sort of statement. But it's a much grayer area when you start thinking about things like, what if your nation is at war and you're being sent to protect your nation from an invading force that's trying to kill you, and you're being asked to kill them before they kill you? Is that wrong? Then we start getting probably a little more divided on the room about what exactly where does that line fall? What becomes justifiable and what's not justifiable? And because we have a nation where assisted suicide, a person who is suffering, there's no cure, they're going to die, they're in pain, there's nothing that will give them respite, is it wrong to say they're ready to end their life, we should end their life? Is that murder or not? We, again, will start to be more divided about that. Self-murder, suicide. Does a person have the right, as their own independent human being with their own dignity and their own rights as a human being, have the right to decide to end their life if they don't want to live it any longer? Again, we'll probably start to have different opinions about this. So what the government will do is the government will say, it can't just be wild chaos where we're all deciding different rules for this. We may have our personal beliefs, but we have to have some framework that's imposed upon us so that we maintain a sense of order. And that's why we will have laws about what counts as murder and what doesn't count as murder. Okay? Now that may or may not agree with what your religion says. So you may be a part of a religion that draws the line in a different place than the government draws the line. And that's where we run into the separation of church and state issues. Should the state have the ability to look at a religion and say, we respect your religious beliefs, but this is where the line will be drawn in our nation, whether you believe it should be drawn there or not? Or, the other direction, members of a religion, should you have the ability to go and impose your religious beliefs on where the line should be drawn onto the government to enforce it among members who are not, people who are in your nation but not members of your religion? I think this is my long-winded way of saying, I think that's where we get into the separation of church and state argument, is influencing each other. Sorry, Craig, I've been keeping you waiting.
No, I just want to say, but that's how government functions.
Yeah.
And that's the purpose of making laws and
It can't be a
legislatures
free-for-all.
and courts and all those things. The Constitution is just a framework. And the Constitution doesn't say and specify how to separate church and state. All the Constitution of the United States says is, you shall not establish a state religion. Just like the Second Amendment doesn't make rules on whether you can pass laws that's for people's good to have gun control. The Second Amendment says the king shouldn't be the only person that decides which people get to have guns and which people don't get to have guns. I mean, it was all about creating a democracy rather than the kingdom, which was what they were used to. And it doesn't get into rules on how you separate church and state and whether local school districts can decide things or not. It's a broader thing at the Constitution.
Once you start putting it into practice.
Yeah.
Once you start putting the document into practice. And so, I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't have a simple answer to. But to your point, then when you're trying to put it in a real world example, what do you do if you are in a situation where you morally believe something differently than what an institution is saying ethically is correct? And that's where you get things like conscientious objectors who refuse to be drafted to serve in the military. Or that's where you get people who bomb abortion clinics, right? From a standpoint of saying, I morally disagree with this ethical structure, and so I'm going to do what I think is right beyond what the rules set in place, right? It's when your personal moral decision making comes from a place where it conflicts with an ethical framework. Now, unpleasant. Why not use the example of saying, is a person who goes and bombs an abortion clinic just simply an evil person, who's an unethical, immoral person? As much as any of us may in the room think that's a really terrible thing, why would you do that? They're making that moral decision from somewhere. And that may be, for example, it may be from a moral standpoint of saying, my state is saying this is unethical, but my religion is saying this is right, and I'm going to follow what my religion says. My religion comes from my religion comes from a pacifist place where I believe all war is wrong. And so even though my government is saying I must go to war to defend democracy and our nation from being defeated by an enemy that's threatening to overthrow us, but my religion is saying it's immoral to bear arms against or to wage war against another person. So therefore I refuse. It gets into all of the tangled messiness about whether or not you can have the 10 Commandments on the wall in a public school, whether or not you can mandate the teaching or non-teaching of evolution, the teaching or non-teaching of the biblical creation story, whether or not you can start a school football service with a prayer before you begin, whether or not a person that's enrolled in your public school that has a no hat policy is allowed to wear a hijab or a burqa. All of these are questions about where church and state intersect and how do they influence one another. Again, I wish I had simple answers, but rather than just trying to give you the simple answer, these are the questions we should be asking.
Nixon was raised because it about Franklin,
Yeah.
and he didn't have a problem going to war.
Right, I mean, Nixon was raised in a religious denomination that would have absolutely been opposed to the Vietnam War, right? And certainly, if nothing else, believed in the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, right? Where did thou shalt not steal come into play during the Watergate break-in and all the plumbers and all of that? So he himself was a complex person, like we all are, trying to figure out how are we going to make moral decisions, particularly when my government is saying one thing and my church is saying something else, which may be the virtues in something like the Church of England, where they may say, oh, we have a state religion, we have our head of state is our head of religion, it's the same person, we'll be in lockstep, we won't have these issues. Now, of course, the reality is messy. Of course, they still have all these same issues that we have. But in theory, having a state religion, whether that's Iran or England or the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in theory, the advantage to having a state religion is you don't have those conflicts. Against the rules in the church is against the law in the state. So we admittedly have opened up for ourselves in the United States and the Episcopal Church a messier scenario. We've made it harder. We've made it harder on ourselves by saying we've got these two things that we're trying to keep separate. But I think it's worthwhile. My personal plug for it is I think it's worthwhile because ideally, in a good world, what's happening in the best case scenario, what it's leading to is dialogue between us, where we should be having these conversations about when is it okay for a person to refuse to be drafted to the military? When is it okay for a person to decide to end their own lives? And not have somebody else say, well, this is what the religion says, it's what the law says, therefore you have no choice. It actually creates a space for us to be able to say, let's think about this theologically. Let's think about this as people and be in dialogue and decide what's right. And maybe it means our religion changes, like we have. When we decided to pass an amendment to our Constitution ordaining women, because we changed. Or maybe it's like our U.S. Constitution, where we decided to make an amendment, and decide that you didn't have to be a white male landowner in order to vote. We made a change. It creates the capacity for growth and change. Sorry, did I see a hand raised with Lance? Did I see? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's for next week, but I was wondering what is the difference. I think last week you referred maybe colloquially to the canons as legislation. Is that what they are? Is that more, you know, the resolutions that are passed in convention become, when they're enacted, become the canons?
Oh.
What is the canons versus the Constitution?
Yes, good question. Very good question. Actually, a good segue. It gets to something Craig was kind of talking about here. It's not exactly right, but I would kind of think of it as sort of like in the United States, how we have a constitution, but then we also have laws, right? And individual laws are not all part of the Constitution. In theory, all of the individual laws are somehow they should be derived and consistent from what we believe in our Constitution, which is why the Supreme Court has the ability to look at a law and say, that doesn't fall within our Constitution, right? Therefore it should be against the law. In the same way, in the Episcopal Church, we have a constitution, which is really this framework of saying, what is the structure of who we are? But then, Craig, like you said, now you have to go out and actually try to live that way. What does it mean to live in accordance with the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Third Amendment, all of these? Just like in the United States, they create laws that are kind of trying to create practical, real-world, real-life examples of now how to do that. We have canons that we've created, which are really those practical, real-world, real-life examples of now here's how we try to be a church that is consistent with what we say we are in the Constitution. And now we can amend that Constitution, which we have over the years. We've amended the Constitution. But then we also pass individual canons or laws that talk about now here's how we try to put those into practice. Does that make sense?
So who's writing the canon? Is that in convention that happens?
And this is general convention, really. Yeah, all of these are set by, and when we look to the Constitution, which I'm beginning to think we're probably not getting to today. That's all right. We needed to back up at a more fundamental level, get to this part. When we get to digging into the Constitution, you'll see among the things that it sets up is the Episcopal Church shall be a democratic institution. We will decide things by popular vote. We will decide things that are included. Who gets to be included in the popular vote? Men and women, members of the clergy and lay. It's not only the priest that gets to vote. The lay people get to vote, should vote. The rules about what constitutes as a diocese, as a territory. You know, what is a right of the diocese versus the right of the national? Just like we have to decide what's a state right versus what's a national right. Same kind of rule. So, but these are all decided in general convention. Every 3 years we get together and we hold votes. And we, just like in the United States, where we have the ability to amend our Constitution, but we make it really hard, which is why it's only been amended a couple of dozen times. Because if we're going to make a change, it has to be something that we've really taken the time to work through, to think through, and we have to be in general agreement about it before we make that change. So when there is a change to the Constitution, there's the ability, and this is something the framers did from the very beginning. They set it up with the ability to change it, but to make it so that it's not so easy to change it, that it's just back and forth going on a whim. We can't decide, well, we don't want slavery this week, but maybe next week we'll want slavery back and we write it back in, right? We had to decide overall, no, this is something we are in general consensus, this will go away. It's the same in the Episcopal Church. We have the ability to amend our Constitution and to amend our canons. Amending the Constitution is somewhat of an arduous process, deliberately so, because we want to make it so it has to pass in both among the bishops and among the priests and lay people and deacons, and it has to pass not just in one general convention, but then so we have to work on it for 3 years, pass it, and then 3 years later, then we have to ratify it and do it again. So we make it a laborious process on purpose, in order to make it so that it's not something we can just do in the heat of the moment. It's not something we can do while this is just the temperature of the room at the time. It has to be something that over the course of years and years, it has come to be the way we feel in consensus as a people, so that we have the ability for it to grow and change. So you can argue. So you can say to anybody, you can argue. When we have decided that we will now start having same-sex marriage in the Episcopal Church, it's not just something that we decided in the spur of the moment. It's something that we have long considered, deeply prayed over, and in general among our bishops and priests and lay people and deacons all together have overwhelmingly decided, yes, this shall be so. So you know when we make a change like that, that it's something that we're serious about as we grow and change.
But then with the canons, that's not necessarily every like some of the resolutions we talked about or looked at in the fall and the summer. That's not all going into the canons as soon as they're passed. Like there's canons are a separate set of resolutions or something like a.
Well, and then there's like local rules don't like the canons are not. The canons are easier to change and update than constitutional amendments are.
Like the resolution we looked at in the fall about what's it called? Socially just like investing. Is that like a resolution that becomes a canon?
That's something we were looking at in the canons, right?
That is a canon as like one of those resolutions that passes in general convention.
Oh, well, that's a good point. Yes, I hear what you're saying. Yes, because there are also other things which are there's also like non-binding resolutions and courtesy resolutions and sort of general statements. There are rules for committees. I'd have to go back and look specifically on that resolution and say, was that a rule for the investment committee, the investment board of the Episcopal Church that's trying to determine how shall we do investing in this church, and should we do investing? Like it's sort of, so that's kind of getting at, like the EPA has its own rules that are not necessarily United States laws, that aren't necessarily constitutional amendments, but the EPA within itself as an institution that's deciding how to do environmental protection will have its own rules and guidelines. Right? And so the Episcopal Church also has lots of committees and things, groups that are like Episcopal Migration Ministries, Episcopal Relief and Development that does disaster aid, things like that. That's kind of like the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, who will all have their own kind of independent rules. Those are much easier to change and evolve over time than constitutional amendments are. Does that help? Okay.
So some stuff that goes through convention is part of the canons or become the canons of constitutions, and some of them are more like
right, and then we also have, like I said, then we also have things like courtesy resolutions, which is like we say hi to our friends over in the Anglican Church of Canada. Hope you're all staying warm up there. And we pass that. That's not going in the canons, right? But it's something we all voted on as a courtesy resolution up to our friends. And then they'll write one back to us saying, yes, hey, Southerners down there, you know, hope you're enjoying your air conditioning. Kim, yes.
It's rare that a tax person has something to contribute to these conversations, but just by way of analogy, Congress passes the tax laws. The Internal Revenue Service writes interpretive regulations under the authority of Congress. There are different hierarchies of regulations. There are also beneath that, sometimes they issue administrative guidance on revenue rulings.
That's a good point.
They issue private letter rulings for an individual taxpayer, but then I can read that and take non-binding guidance from a publication of the IRS's position on the topic.
Right.
So there's this huge body of guidance around tax laws, but they have different levels of authority and different levels of interpretive weight, and the higher up the authority chain you go, the harder it is to change.
Right. I was trying
Yeah,
to.
that's a good way of
And
putting it.
then there are the court decisions, right?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out where the canons
fall.
It sounds like the canons are like the regulations.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to,
The federal laws. are
it's kind of
state
equivalent,
laws,
this is,
you know.
if you're gonna, yeah, draw sort of an equivalent, especially since we also have a Diocese of Chicago
Yeah.
Constitution and canons, which would be the version of, like, that would be the equivalent of the Illinois State Constitution and Illinois state laws. This would be the equivalent of the United States Constitution and federal law.
Yeah.
And then we have local state of Illinois Constitution and state of Illinois laws. Then we'll have like local city ordinances in the city of Chicago, right? And again, that gets to kind of like here at St. James, we have local rules that we refer to about how we do things here just at St. James. And then we have things which are really more sort of like guidelines and policies. We haven't necessarily made a law about it that we put in our bylaws, but we have a rule about it. We haven't put it in our bylaws, for example, how our vergers and acolytes are supposed to dress on a Sunday morning. But we have internal local rules about how we expect it to be done. That help? Yes. And we could really easily start saying to our acolytes, we want you to wear a different colored robe. And we wouldn't have to pass legislation to do that. Versus the Constitution, right? And so you're right, Kim, I think that's really helpful to say, like, sort of like, as the higher you go and the more people it affects, the harder it is to change, it.
On the other hand, that's not to say legislators don't pass stupid laws that never should be laws to begin with. I mean, there's all kinds of, you know,
Yeah.
stupid laws that get passed and get, you know, written into the federal.
We never
legal
passed stupid
code
laws in
or-
the Episcopal
or-
Church.
Or the canons of the church.
Yeah. No, we passed some things that we look back later and like, oh, shouldn't have done that, and we reverse it later. All right, well, I promise we are not meeting for forum next week because we're going to do annual meetings for everybody. Come at 10 o'clock for worship, and then the annual meeting immediately following, but then the week after this. Well, I think we're ready to dig into Constitution and look at the language about that. So, thank you for.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you for kind of setting like, oh, we need to take a step back, and we're not ready to talk about this yet. We still have more groundwork to do. So, thank you, everybody.